friends, welcome back to Kelly Does Stuff. It's December. I don't know how that happened. Like, did November even exist? I don't feel like it did. But here we are. And today I'm going to show you how I made a little mini polar mountain. And I made this a while ago. One day I was just like, I just feel like making a mountain. I'd also been thinking about different displays and things I want to do for a couple of my Christmas villages. I have a North Pole village and I have a Dickens village. So it was kind of an experiment, but on a smaller scale. I have no idea what I'm going to do with this mountain, but I think that you can take these kind of tools and principles and ideas and techniques, whatever the words are, and apply them to any size, shape, design mountain that you want, Christmas or otherwise. So let's create a mountain.
All right, I'm gonna use a piece of XPS foam as the base to my mountain. I'm making a small mountain, so I'm going with a small base. And the first thing I wanna do is just round off those corners. If you have hot wire tools and you wanna use them, go ahead and break them out. I do have those tools, but you guys know how much I love using a blade. My little mountain is going to include a waterfall that spills into a lake. So the first thing that I'm going to do is create the shape of the lake using some scrap styrofoam that I'm going to add on top of the base piece of styrofoam. Another option for creating lakes or other bodies of water is to carve out those shapes from the base piece of foam using a hot wire tool. And if you've never done this before, don't be intimidated. There is no one right way to do this. You're basically just playing around with foam to get the shape that you want. And then I just use some hot glue to attach all of my pieces in place. I'm making the lake smaller than the base because I'm going to build up the shape of my mountain around the lake. And on one side, I wanted to create some stone steps because maybe a little winter explorer is going to want to hike up to the top of the waterfall. And here are those icy, rocky stone steps I was talking about. I am not measuring any of this. I'm not trying to make anything even. I want it to look kind of natural and organic looking. Like, you know how sometimes you go hiking and you're like, wow, look, these stone steps formed naturally just for me. That's a real thing that happens, right? So even though this mountain is not big enough to be able to feature one of my lighted buildings, I should be able to fit a couple of accessories on the mountain, or maybe like a polar bear or a penguin. So as I am carving lots of jagged rocky detail and creating these different layers and steps, I'm also making sure that there are spaces that are big enough, wide enough, or long enough to fit one of those accessories, and making sure that that surface is going to be smooth enough for those accessories to be able to stay upright. Once I've built up my mountain and kind of added those details to the side, I'm gonna start adding some rock detail to the face of the mountain because you can see right now that that is way too smooth. One thing to keep in mind as you are building the mountain is, what do you want the overall look to be? You can see that the pieces that I am attaching are smaller, and so I'm gonna have kind of a bumpy, rocky mountain, but you might be going for a look of like clean slabs of slate, like these slick lines that maybe just have some jagged edges. And so you would just kind of cut and shape your styrofoam to give that effect. So I'm cutting that foam into all shapes and sizes, adjusting length and width, but also remember that you can cut your foam to reduce the thickness of your pieces as well. I am working with scraps of XPS foam that come in a sheet that is 1 inch thick, but I don't want all of the rock pieces to be that thick, especially on the face of the mountain. So again, I'm just going to use that blade to get the size that I want. Now, it can get a little tricky with a blade when you get with bigger pieces of foam, and that's where a hot wire table could come in handy. But for small pieces, a blade should be just fine. Once I had all my styrofoam rocks in place and the shape of my mountain was finished, it was time to start plastering. I like to work with sheets of plaster that come in a big long roll, and then I can cut them down to the size that I need. I also have my plaster bowl that I never rinse out. It is filled with all of the residue of projects past. I wear gloves, and then I also like to wear a mask when I'm unrolling that plaster and kind of shaking it out into the bowl, because there's a lot of dust that kind of stirs up in the air, and that can be a bit irritating. We're going to fill that bowl up with water and then cut the sheets of plaster to whatever size is manageable for you to work with. I think I do about 6 to 8 inches, maybe some pieces a little longer and some a little bit smaller. Now, once you do that, you'll probably have a lot of loose plaster left that's going to kind of shake from those sheets when you cut them. I like to scoop all of that into my bowl of water, because if you look at those plaster sheets, it has a grid pattern to them. And most of the time, as you are stretching that plaster over the rocks, that grid pattern is going to show through in some spots. And you don't want that, because when it dries, you're going to see it. So you can scoop up that wet plaster from the bowl and fill in those grids. And that's a big reason that I never rinse out my plaster bowl, because I just kind of get to accumulate all that plaster from project to project. Okay, so one little trick to make sure that you have a finished product that you really like is try not to drape one sheet of plaster over too far of an area. Let that one little sheet get good coverage on just a small section of those rocks. You're going to want to smooth it around all of those shapes that you made and into all of those nooks and crannies. That's really going to help those rock details show, versus just kind of a look where you've got some plaster draped over some stuff. I'm also covering that lake area in plaster because at this point in the project, I wasn't sure what I wanted to use to create my water effect, and I wanted to give myself the option of using something called Realistic Water by Woodland Scenics. And to use that product, you must cover your foam in plaster because it will leak and eat through your foam. If you've seen some of my past videos, you know the great times and varying success I have had with that product. So wasn't sure if I was going to use it, but I at least wanted to give myself the option. So this whole thing is just going to be covered in plaster. All right, I think you've been able to see the grid lines and some of those holes in the plaster there. So every once in a while, I'm gonna scoop some of that goopy plaster out of my bowl and fill everything in. This is also a good time to smooth out any of the seams from the overlapping plaster. Now, I am not a plaster expert, like I have very minimal knowledge, but one thing that I have learned from doing this is if I have a lot of water as I'm applying that goopy plaster, I will get cracks in the finished piece. And when you see this, you will see that there are some cracks. But as I'm scooping the goopy stuff out, I try to kind of squeeze out some of that extra water. And this is another opportunity to think about what you want that finished mountain to look like. Do you want that really sleek, smooth look? I like to leave behind some of that grittiness that the plaster is going to provide when it dries. It is just an easy way to add some depth and texture to your piece that is really going to pop once you start to do the painting. And now the boring part. We have to wait for that plaster to dry. It can take about 24 to 48 hours. I want to show you the back because I don't do anything to it. I don't plaster or paint it because I typically don't do 360 displays, so you never see the backs of my pieces. Okay, here's my paint. We've just got a plain white acrylic paint, this neon blue. I grabbed some dark gray that I don't think I ended up using, and then this kind of icy metallic blue. This is my favorite brush to use when applying my base coat. It's fat, it's fluffy, and round. My base coat is going to be a light blue that I am achieving by mixing the neon blue and the white together. And prior to painting my mountain, I had experimented with some different shades of blues and grays, so that way when it was time to paint this, I knew exactly the color that I wanted. Now maybe you are creating a giant mountain and you're like, I'm not gonna spend the rest of my life painting this base coat. Thank you very much. Can I use spray paint? Yes, you can. As long as you have covered your styrofoam in either plaster or you have protected any exposed foam, you can use spray paint to do your base coat or any coats that you want. Spray paint will eat through foam, which, depending on your project, could be a really cool effect, or if you're not prepared for it, it will ruin your project. While my base coat was still wet, I added some of that neon blue into the holes and crevices of the mountain, and this was kind of the first step in starting to bring out some of the details in the mountain. Right now with the base coat, it just kind of looks like a big blobby light blue mountain, but we want this to look a little bit icy. I think the dark blue also really brings out like the cold effect. Like it looks cold to me when I look at it. So here's what it looks like after that first pass of paint. I let that dry, and then I'm gonna go in with some white and blues and just kind of start to add color to places that I want to accentuate or bring out more detail. This is the first time I've ever painted like a blue icy mountain, so a lot of this was just kind of playing around and experimenting. And then the lake, I really want to be that darkest blue, and I think a little bit about like what part is going to be the deepest part of the lake, have that be a little bit darker, maybe get lighter towards the edges. I don't get that serious with it. I try to think about it. I'm not like an artist, and so I just kind of play around and have fun. Put on some music, let the brush tell you what to do, and the mountain tell you what it wants, and just go for it. Once that is completely dry, I'm going to go in with a white paint and a dry brushing technique. So we just get a little bit of paint on that brush. You can see I'm getting a lot of it off. And then we're just going to go really quickly over our piece. So with a little bit of paint and those quick brush strokes, we're just going to start getting the highlights. All that gritty detail is now going to pop with this white paint. We're not getting into any of those ridges and grooves. Before I could move on to the next step, I had to have the quality control inspector let me know if it was acceptable. I think I passed. I'm going to use that icy blue metallic paint to add some sheen and shimmer to my mountain, just kind of hitting the edges with a little bit of this color. I did the same thing with some white pearl metallic paint to give it even more of a shine. Decided to make my lake out of hot glue, so I'm going to use some parchment paper to trace out the shape. That will be the guide for applying my hot glue to the parchment paper. And for some reason, after tracing out the lake, my brain was like, hey, let's make the waterfall first. So that is what I'm doing here, also making it on parchment paper. And hot glue, when it cools, won't stick to parchment paper. But if you want a little bit of extra assurance that everything is going to come up smoothly and easily, you can just add a little bit of lotion to your parchment paper, which is what I did. That's why it looks all wrinkly and bubbly there. Now, hot glue waterfall is so simple to make, but I do have a tutorial if you want just a little bit more detail. Now to create our lake, we just want to fill in that shape that we traced with the hot glue. I'm going for more of a frozen lake look, so I want it to kind of be peaceful and calm, not a lot of ripples or movement in the water. And to achieve this, I need to work very quickly, and I want my hot glue to be boiling, bubbling hot. That way each ring that I'm applying around the lake will melt into each other to give it more of a solid look. If you let those rings cool a little bit, you'll notice the lines in between the rings, which could be a very cool look if you're wanting to add some ripple or movement to the water. That wasn't the look that I was going for, so I wanted to kind of all blend as best as I can. You'll also see that I am switching between hot glue guns because as I add a new stick of hot glue, it takes a couple seconds for that to get hot enough to be bubbly and boily and melting together. So this was just a great easy way to always make sure that I had hot glue ready to go. And here's one of those lines that I was talking about. I don't love it, but it's gonna be fine. And if you look closely in the center of the lake, the hot glue kind of dried funky there as well, which also doesn't thrill me. But I'm going to kind of cover up that spot with the placement of the waterfall. The waterfall is going to hit the lake right at that spot, and then we're also going to add some splashy effect so you're not even going to notice that funky little spot in the middle of the lake. And to create our splashy effect, we are going to add a pool of hot glue at the base of the waterfall on the lake. We might need to hold the waterfall in place for a second or two to make sure the waterfall is secure in place. And we want to let that little pool of glue get pretty cool, but not all the way cool. We're going to grab a toothpick and we're going to start pulling up on that hot glue to create our splashy effect. Remember, this is your creation, so you can make it as realistic or as fantastical as you want. You could have that waterfall hit that lake with such serenity, not a splash of water out of place. You could have it be this big, rushing, chaotic, ripply water. And if anybody's like, that is not realistic, you tell them, thanks, I didn't ask you. Okay, nearing the finish line. To complete our waterfall, I'm just going to add a little bit of white acrylic paint to the waterfall and the splashes. I do have a video on this that goes into a little bit more detail, but it is pretty straightforward. We're just painting on the hot glue. Now, typically when you paint on hot glue, I would tell you to wipe that down with a paper towel. It allows the paint to stick a little bit better. However, we are not trying to do a thorough coat here. We're just trying to give this water a little bit of detail and movement. It's a bit of a dry brushing technique, so you should have no problem applying this paint directly to the hot glue without any paper towel action. And then finally, let's add a little shimmer and sparkle to our mountain. Just adding a little bit of PVA glue and some white glittery shimmer, just kind of hitting some spots. Or maybe a lot of spots. I can get a little carried away when shimmer and sparkle is involved. And there we have it. Our mini mountain is complete. Let's take a look. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this video and found some helpful tools for your own creations. I would love it so very much if you would give this video a like, and please, if you haven't already, I would greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe to my channel. I look forward to seeing you guys next time, and happy creating!